Hello there everybody, welcome to a new episode of the vlog. I thought I'd delve into my record collection a little bit again today and go into some of the albums and singles I have by the legendary James Brown. Now I've done a little bit of a history series on this channel that did fairly well and I was very happy with. And it's called The James Brown Story, and I'll put a link to that in the description. But today, I just wanted to focus on my collection of singles and albums by the man himself. So just a little disclaimer here, I am from Canada, so pretty much everything I show you here is going to be a Canadian pressing unless I specify otherwise. Now my James Brown collection here is a little bit modest compared to some. One of the great things about James Brown is he released so many albums in his life. What is it, like 70-something albums? And probably when you look at the singles total that he released in his career, that's probably in the 3 digits. So there's just so much to find. But also, people kind of know what they have with James Brown. You don't get a lot of good deals on James Brown records from what I've been able to find. Clearly, I'm not the only one out there scouring the shelves for any new James Brown stuff that comes in. Oftentimes, I find the best way to find his stuff is in the new arrivals because sometimes they don't make it to the regular sales floor. But in any case, I'll start from the beginning here. And my favorite piece in my entire James Brown collection is the one that started it all from 1956. Please, please, please. This is an original 78. Well, I can't be sure exactly when it was on store shelves, but 78s were completely phased out by 1959, so I know it's relatively early on, of course, Federal Records, the subsidiary of King, and the song on the B-side, of course, being Why Do You Do Me. I found a copy of this single on Discogs at a reasonable price, finally, after looking for a long time. I purchased it, and it got shipped here, and to my horror, it was actually cracked in 2 pieces when it arrived at my house. And I made it a little video series to restore this single. I actually used wood glue and an incredible amount of time and patience to make sure that the grooves aligned perfectly, and I was able to get it in working, albeit not great, shape. But just to be able to put this on a turntable and listen to it is incredible. And then, of course, that became like his signature song as well, so I felt like it was a very important piece for my collection. Moving on to the album version of Please, 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 which originally came out in late 1958. This is one of the newer Pan Am Records copies from, what was it, 2011, it says on the back here. Nothing special about this. I just saw it on a store shelf in London Drugs here in Canada, and they had a copy of it. It's just on this weird red label, Pan Am Records. I don't particularly love the way this sounds either, but it was one of those records that I doubted that I would ever be able to find an actual original copy of, so I decided to buy this one. This one, for some reason, they've thrown in the song This Old Heart as a bonus, as if this 16-track album wasn't long enough. And then staying with the more modern reissues, here is a 2008 copy of Live at the Apollo from the Back to Black series. This one is on a Polydor label here. It is not really tracked in any way. Each side is just presented as one long track, just like it was in the original. But yeah, again, like the previous one, it was a situation where I didn't like my chances of being able to find an original, so I was okay with picking up a reissue. And then from that album, I actually have a single that was issued from it. On one side, it's got that live version of I'll Go Crazy, and on the other side, a shortened version of Lost Someone, again on the Canadian Delta labels. I believe this was a little bit later. I don't think this single got issued until about 1966, 1967 or so. Night Train. Like I mentioned, I am Canadian, so here's a Canadian Delta Records copy of Night Train with, of course, Why Does Everything Have to Happen to Me on the B-side. This one's not in the best shape ever, but yep, King Records singles, or at the very least James Brown singles, were distributed by Delta here in Canada. Shortly after the release of Live at the Apollo, James Brown had a moderate hit with his copy of Mashed Potatoes USA. I bought this on a road trip down to Seattle, so this is one of the American, really beautiful blue label King Records singles. Always wanted to find one of those, and I found a few on that trip, a couple more that I will show you here as we go through the collection here. In 1963, James had a big hit with Prisoner of Love. This is actually a radio copy from CBC Radio that I received here in Vancouver. I don't think it's any different than the actual retail single. I think it is a retail single, but I know it was in the collection of a radio DJ with Choo Choo on the B-side there. And I also am very thrilled to have the album for Prisoner of Love. I always loved the painted cover of this. This is not an original. This is from about, I would date this pressing as about 1965, 66 or so, and it's on a Canadian blue label on the King Records subsidiary Regency. What's interesting here about the Canadian pressings is it's an American jacket. Regency Records would use the American King Records sleeves straight from their U.S. plant, but the record itself on Regency would be manufactured in Canada. Following the success of the Live at the Apollo album, he put out a second live album called Pure Dynamite, and on that album was a song called Oh Baby, Don't You Weep, and I always liked that live version, and here it is presented in all of its two-part glory. I want to say this was James Brown's first two-part single. It would become pretty normal for him to release two-part singles a little bit later in his career, but I think this was the first one. Again, Canadian Delta label. And now, moving on to 1965, I have another album on Regency. This is an early pressing of Papa's Got a Brand New Bag in mono. Every album that I've showed you so far has been in mono. And like I said before with the Regency pressings, this is on an original American King Records sleeve, but the labels are those same second generation blue label Regency labels. That's how I know that it wasn't an original pressing of Prisoner of Love. It was on a different Regency label design originally before they switched to these in the mid-60s. But I believe this is a fairly early copy of Papa's Got a Brand New Bag. Back to the singles. Big hit for 1966. It's a man's world. Massive hit. One of his most important songs. Again, on the Canadian Delta Records Burgundy label here. That one's got Is It Yes or Is It No on the B-side. One of James' most important singles of all time, Cold Sweat. If Papa's Got a Brand New Bag is the song that invented funk, Cold Sweat certainly refined it into what it would become. Like I mentioned earlier, most of his singles later on would become two-part singles, and this is, of course, one of the most famous examples of that. Now, I have some questions that I'd like you to answer in the comments about this King Red label. I believe I got this one on my American trip as well, so it's an American copy. But I have no idea why it's on a red label. I've looked it up online, and I found a few other releases that are on red labels. I want you to let me know. Does that mean it's a reissue? Does that mean it's some sort of weird record club release? Please let me know. I'm not really sure what makes something a red label pressing from the regular blue label that King Records would usually have. One more 60s James Brown single here. This one is a little bit worse for wear. It is It Won't Be Me on the B-side on the A-side is It Won't Be Me. I actually really like that track. And then on the B-side here we have Mona Lisa, and then the song It Won't Be Me would wind up on the I've Got the Feeling album. On, again, King Records, another of his great 60s studio albums, I've Got the Feeling, or I Got the Feeling, rather. I love this album cover with the word feelin' exuded from each of his thumbs. It's great. It's got the same back cover with a list of other James Brown albums you can buy. I believe this is a relatively early copy. It is a Canadian pressing, but by this point, even the Canadian pressings are on blue King Records label, so that's awesome to see. Still in 1968 here, I've got the single release for, I'm going to say, James Brown's most important song he ever recorded. Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud, another two-part single, and another original American blue label copy, which I'm really excited to have. Not in the best of shape, but it plays through pretty well. And in the interest of putting live albums where they belong in his chronology, I'm going to move on here to a relatively new release. Say It Live and Loud, live in Dallas. This was recorded just over a week after the single Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud was released. And I made a review of this album that you can find on this channel. I love this so much. It's not just James Brown's Star Time set, but it's also his early set and instrumentals by the James Brown Orchestra. Just a great album in his collection, and it's become sort of a must-have. I think it's such an important performance. I wish they'd release his Boston Garden performance from the same year at some point on vinyl. That would be really cool. So this was released in 2018, this copy, celebrating the 50th anniversary of the performance. And the next year, they released another 50th anniversary live album. This is James Brown live at home with his bad self, recorded in Atlanta, Georgia on October 1st, 1969. An interesting era for James Brown and his band. A lot of these tracks would wind up on the Sex Machine live album, but there's lots here that were not released on that. Another one that I highly recommend. Oh, and one thing they did on this one that I really liked is the recreation of the later era King Records center ring design. I love that. Alright, now I'm going to move on into the 70s here with another one of James Brown's biggest hits of his career. Get Up, or in parentheses, I Feel Like Being a Sex Machine. Another two-part single. This is on a King Blue label, which is what they were using for Canadian pressings at the time. I believe it would have been on one of those black and burgundy labels in America, but you get it on the Blue King Records label in Canada. Or maybe it was on this label design. I'm actually not quite sure. This is the later era King Records sleeve. Let me give you a better example on the B-side. Sorry, this one's got some stickers on it because it came from that same CBC radio lot. So this was owned by a DJ and had the property of CBC sticker put on it. But yeah, another two-part, or this is not a two-part single. It's got the vocal on one side and the instrumental on the other. Hey America was a bit of a kind of like a Christmas song, but also like a social commentary at the same time. Not one of my favorites of his, but it's an interesting piece that I knew I had to pick up the second I saw it. That's the end of his King Records era stuff. In 1971, he moved to Polydor with the release of the Hot Pants album. Look at this back cover here. Wow. Yeah, Hot Pants was his first album for Polydor in 1971, and I just love it. This is not on what you would expect of his Polydor labels. This is not on one of the ones with his face. Granted, it is a Canadian pressing, but I've even seen Canadian pressings of this album with the James Brown production part of the label. I don't have that here. Maybe that means this is a reissue. Maybe that means this is a Record Club issue. Please let me know if you know the answer to that. Now, I am severely lacking in James Brown's 1970s content. In fact, there is a whole 7-year gap in my collection here. We move on to one I just picked up in a bargain bin here, Mother's Nature. And I picked it up in a bargain bin for a reason, because it's not in the best of shape. But this shows you what I'm talking about what a usual Polydor James Brown center ring label would look like. I absolutely love these. Well, I've always been confused as to why it says Soul 1 on it. I thought that was in place of like a side 1, and then the other side would say Soul 2, but no, both sides say Soul 1. Interesting album from his, most people would argue now we're into his post-classic period. In December, I believe, of 1979, on a tour in Japan, he records this double live album, James Brown Live Hot on the 1. By the time this album came out, though, I believe it was 1980. It's a double album, but it has no gatefold. Oh, I like these old school Polydor center ring labels. Again, look at this. This is towards the end of James Brown's career with Polydor. Again, I'm doing a terrible job collecting his Polydor era material, but that's one of the fun things about collecting for James Brown is there's always so much more to be had. But I have some of his later career here. Now we move on to his Scotty Bros Records releases. I do not have a copy of the Gravity album. I'd love to have one. What I do have is, of course, the Rocky IV soundtrack, which has Livin' in America on it. I also have a copy with a highly damaged, unfortunately, original sleeve, but the record inside is good, of the 7-inch single for the song Gravity from the album of the same name, and on the B-side is just the Gravity dub mix. Speaking of singles from the Gravity LP, here's a 12-inch single that I found for How Do You Stop. I thought this was pretty cool, and it's got the song Goliath on the B-side. Here's the Scotty Bros label on this one. And then staying with his Scotty Bros tenure, the last of the full-size albums that I have is his 1988 album, I'm Real. This one's actually in great shape. I mean, just look at the corners on here. Not my favorite James Brown album, but one that I thought would be pretty hard to find, so I was pretty stoked to come across a copy of this one, like I said, on the Scotty Bros label by this point in his career. And that's just about the end of my James Brown collection here. I have one more single of his from 1991, just after he got out of his brief stint in prison. He made a new album called Love Overdue, which had the single So Tired of Standing Still, I've Got to Move On. Yeah, sometimes the later era stuff can be a bit harder to find just because vinyl had sort of fallen out of favor and become like, I think it was the number 3 format by 1991. CD and cassette had definitely passed it. But that does it for my James Brown collection. I have albums and singles of his that span 35 years of his career, but I mean, his career would go on another 15 years after that. Like I mentioned, check out my video series on the history of his amazing career, as well as some other James Brown related videos I've made. I made an obituary for his legendary Cape Man and MC Danny Ray when he passed away a couple of years ago. I was very sad to hear about that, but thank you for sitting through this sort of display of my James Brown collection. Let me know in the comments if there's anything that I have that maybe you don't, that you are interested in. I'm well aware of all the various things that are missing from my collection, but again, that's the fun. There's always so much more to collect. Thank you guys so much for watching. For those of you who don't know, I am a musician, and in the description below are links to where you can find my music, where it's sold or streamed online. Like this video if you like what you saw, subscribe to my channel if you've been enjoying my videos, and you can ring the notification bell if you want to be notified whenever I upload a new video. I've been doing a little bit less rock and roll history content, but that's going to change. This last little while I've been so busy with my own music career that I haven't had the time to sit down and make some of these videos, but I've got a few coming up that I'm really excited about, so stay tuned to this channel for some future fun rock and roll related content. Thanks again for watching, and I'll catch you again real soon.